It is the 25th of March, 1945. Somewhere over northern Germany, a stream of RAF Lancaster bombers carves through the darkness at 20,000 feet. On the ground below, sirens are wailing. The German civil defense network springs into its well-rehearsed routine. And on the medium-wave dial, something extraordinary is happening. A German radio station, one that German listeners have known for years, one they trust, one that sounds precisely like every other official broadcast they have ever heard, suddenly begins telling them things that are not true. The voice is calm. The diction is flawless. The accent is perfect Hochdeutsch, the clipped, authoritative tone of a German military announcer. But the words are not coming from Germany. They are coming from a forest in Sussex. In a heavily reinforced concrete bunker buried 50 feet beneath the Ashdown forest near the market town of Crowborough, operators wearing headphones are bent over their equipment. They are monitoring the German network. They are watching the frequencies. And the moment a German transmitter in the target zone falls silent, as German protocol demanded it must, to prevent Allied bombers from using it as a navigational beacon, they pounce. Aspidistra takes the frequency. The broadcast continues seamlessly. German listeners hear nothing unusual. What they hear, however, is now something else entirely. This is the story of the most powerful radio transmitter in the world at the time of its construction, a machine so secret that even the BBC did not know it existed for the first months of its operation. A device that could reach from England into German living rooms, into the headphones of Luftwaffe pilots, into the offices of Wehrmacht officers who had not the faintest idea they were listening to the enemy. A weapon made not of steel or explosive, but of signal, suggestion, and spectacularly well-crafted lies. It was called Aspidistra. Its story remained buried under official secrets for half a century. And to understand why it was built, you need to understand what Britain was up against. By 1940, Nazi Germany operated the most sophisticated state broadcasting apparatus in the world. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, had understood from the very beginning that radio was not merely a means of communication, it was a means of control. By 1939, Germany had achieved near-total radio penetration of its civilian population, with the cheaply manufactured Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, sitting in roughly 70% of German homes. It was not designed to receive foreign stations. It was designed to receive one thing clearly, the voice of the Reich. The German military broadcasting system was equally formidable. Across occupied Europe, a network of powerful medium-wave transmitters kept the population informed, or rather, kept the population receiving what the Reich wished them to know. These transmitters were interconnected, broadcasting synchronized content from central sources, their signals blanketing the continent with an authority that no Allied station could easily challenge. Britain had the BBC, of course, and the BBC's European service worked tirelessly to broadcast the truth into occupied territory. But there was a fundamental problem of physics. The BBC's most powerful transmitters were formidable by the standards of peacetime broadcasting. They were not, however, formidable enough. To punch a signal deep into Germany with the clarity and strength needed to dominate the medium-wave band, to sound, in other words, as though you were local, you needed raw power on a scale that simply did not exist in Britain. German operators, for their part, knew this. They knew that Allied broadcasts could be identified and jammed. They knew that if something sounded like it was coming from a distance, it probably was. The psychological power of radio lies partly in intimacy, in the sense that the voice in the speaker is close, is present, is credible. A distant, crackly broadcast undermining Wehrmacht morale was easy to dismiss. A broadcast that sounded like it was coming from the station down the road was something else entirely. What Britain needed was not better content. It had excellent writers, German-speaking émigrés, brilliant propagandists. What it needed was power, incomprehensible, unprecedented, overwhelming power. And, as so often in the history of this war, the answer was found not in a government laboratory or a military workshop, but in the tangled, unlikely corridors of transatlantic commerce. The story of Aspidistra begins not in wartime Britain, but in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the early 1930s. An American broadcasting pioneer named Powell Crosley, Jr., owner of the radio station WLW, had a vision of a transmitter so powerful that it would dominate the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. He commissioned the Radio Corporation of America to build it for him. RCA, working alongside General Electric and Westinghouse, produced something extraordinary. A 500-kilowatt medium-wave transmitter, 10 times more powerful than anything else operating in the United States, at an estimated cost of $400,000. WLW went to air at 500 kilowatts on the 1st of May, 1934. The signal was so powerful that it interfered with broadcasts as far away as Canada and South America. Residents living near the transmitter reported hearing broadcasts from their household wiring. Their dental fillings in some cases were picking up the signal. The American Federal Communications Commission was not amused. In 1939, it ordered WLW back to 50 kilowatts in perpetuity, citing interference regulations. The transmitter sat unused, unsellable within the United States, gathering dust in an RCA warehouse. Winston Churchill, who understood the power of words perhaps better than any other wartime leader, needed it. In May 1941, he personally sanctioned its purchase. The British Secret Service moved quickly. They were not the only interested party. The Chinese government had also made inquiries. But the British pipped them to the post, closing the deal for £165,000. The engineer sent to negotiate the transaction was a man named Harold Robin, a meticulous signals specialist who would remain connected to Aspidistra for the rest of its working life. It was Robin who would, 41 years later, have the honor of switching it off for the last time. The transmitter was shipped across the Atlantic, at no small risk given the state of the U-boat war, and a location had to be found for it. The initial proposal was an old gravel pit in Bedfordshire. The chief engineer of the Secret Service overruled this almost immediately. The whole point of the machine was to sound local to a German audience. Every additional mile of distance meant additional signal degradation. The transmitter needed to be as far east and as far south as possible. The location settled upon was King Standing, a high ridge in the Ashdown Forest near Crowborough in East Sussex, roughly 75 miles due west of Calais. What followed was one of the more extraordinary feats of wartime construction. A battalion of Canadian Army engineers was brought in to excavate the site, digging a foundation hole 50 feet deep to create the underground bunker that would house the equipment. 600 men worked on the reinforced concrete shell. The resulting structure was designed in the Art Deco style, then fashionable for industrial buildings, though since it sat largely underground, this was a peculiarity visible mostly to the operators who worked there. Above ground, 3 guide masts were erected, each one 110 meters, roughly 360 feet, tall, their arrays angled deliberately to direct the signal broadly eastward towards occupied Europe. The transmitter itself required more power than the local electrical grid could provide. 2 enormous flat-8 diesel engines with blown superchargers, manufactured by Crossley Premier, were installed. A single flywheel alternator rated at 3,190 horsepower provided the current. The whole facility was self-sufficient, self-contained, and entirely deniable. When Aspidistra went on air on the 8th of November, 1942, it was operating at 500 kilowatts, soon upgraded to 600 kilowatts. At that moment, it was the most powerful broadcast transmitter on Earth. But raw power, on its own, is not a weapon. What made Aspidistra genuinely dangerous was something more subtle: the ability to move. Most medium-wave transmitters of the era were fixed to a single frequency. It was the nature of the technology. Aspidistra had been engineered to retune rapidly, shifting from one frequency to another in a matter of seconds, a capability almost unheard of in contemporary broadcasting. This meant that its operators could chase German transmitters across the dial, could shift to match whatever frequency a German station happened to be using, and could, in the right circumstances, make Aspidistra sound indistinguishable from a station the German public had been listening to all their lives. The operational use of Aspidistra was overseen by the Political Warfare Executive, a clandestine British organization established in 1941 to coordinate propaganda activities across all fronts. The man placed in charge of its most sensitive broadcasting operations was Sefton Delmer, a German-born British journalist who had covered the rise of Hitler for the Daily Express and who possessed an almost preternatural understanding of the German character, its vanities, its fears, and its vulnerabilities. Delmer's philosophy was what he called black propaganda, material that did not announce itself as British, that did not wave the Union flag or invoke Churchill, but instead masqueraded as coming from within the German system itself. The logic was elegant. A German soldier who knew he was listening to British propaganda could dismiss it. A German soldier who believed he was listening to an unofficial German station, one that sounded credibly German, that played familiar music, that relayed genuine Wehrmacht news alongside carefully crafted demoralizing material, was far harder to inoculate against. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The flagship operation powered by Aspidistra was Soldatensender Calais, Soldiers Radio Calais, which went to air on the 14th of November, 1943. The name was a deliberate misdirection. The station claimed to be broadcasting from Calais, in occupied France, and the choice of location was shrewd. Calais was where the German military had a substantial presence, and a station ostensibly serving those troops would have obvious credibility. In reality, the programs were produced at a purpose-built studio in Milton Bryan, Bedfordshire, and broadcast from the transmitter in Crowborough, Sussex. Soldatensender Calais operated from 6 o'clock in the evening until dawn. It played the latest German popular music. It covered sporting events and provided results. It relayed genuine speeches by Hitler and other Nazi officials because nothing established credibility like the actual voice of the Führer. And then, woven through the legitimate content, came what Delmer himself described as the station's operating formula: cover, cover, dirt, cover, dirt. Good music to draw the listener in, credible content to establish trust, and then, inserted smoothly and without fanfare, material designed to corrode confidence. Stories of officers defrauding their men, rumors of incompetence in the high command, suggestions that troops being transferred from France to the Eastern Front were being swindled by confidence men. The Nazis attempted to silence it with jamming. Their efforts met with limited success. Aspidistra's 600 kilowatts simply drowned out the interference. Starting in 1943, Aspidistra was also turned against the Luftwaffe's night fighter operations. During RAF Bomber Command's assault on Germany, the Battle of Berlin, and the raids that preceded it, German radar stations broadcast the movements of the bomber streams, with ground controllers directing fighter crews toward their targets. German-speaking RAF operators, using Aspidistra's power to overwhelm the genuine German controllers' signals, impersonated those controllers. They issued false vectors. They directed night fighters away from the bomber streams and toward empty sky. The full extent to which this disrupted German interceptions remains difficult to quantify, but the capability was real, and it was used. The operations of early 1945 represented Aspidistra at its most audacious. By then, Germany's broadcast network was fragmenting under the pressure of Allied advances. Transmitters were being destroyed. The network that had once delivered seamless, synchronized content across the Reich was developing holes. And the Political Warfare Executive had developed what historians would later recognize as an early prototype of what computer security professionals now call a man-in-the-middle attack. The mechanism was this: when Allied bombers approached a German city, The local radio transmitter would switch off to deny the RAF a navigational beacon. The German network, however, continued broadcasting from transmitters elsewhere. The moment a target area station fell silent, Aspidistra would take its frequency. Initially, the operators would simply relay the content from still active German stations, so that listeners experienced no interruption. Having established themselves seamlessly in the stream, they would then begin to make adjustments. The first such intrusion operation took place on the 25th of March, 1945. 5 days later, Aspidistra intruded on the Berlin and Hamburg frequencies with an announcement warning German citizens that the Allies were attempting to spread confusion by sending false telephone messages from occupied towns to unoccupied ones. This was, of course, itself a false message, delivered in Germany's own voice, designed to sow the very confusion it claimed to warn against. On the 8th of April, the Hamburg and Leipzig stations were intruded upon with warnings about forged banknotes in circulation. On the 9th of April, announcements encouraged the population to evacuate to 7 supposedly bomb-free zones in central and southern Germany. All of these announcements were fabrications. All of them were delivered so convincingly that German listeners had no reliable means of identifying them as enemy broadcasts. The station's last transmission as Soldatensender Calais, briefly renamed Soldatensender West after the Allies overran the Pas de Calais in September 1944, came on the 30th of April, 1945. It ceased without announcement, without explanation, as though the station had simply gone off air for the night and never returned. How does one measure the impact of a weapon that fires not explosives but ideas? It is genuinely difficult. Soldatensender Calais achieved audience figures that no official Allied broadcaster could match, but the precise effect on German morale and military decision-making remains contested by historians. The German military was aware, by late in the war, that something unusual was happening on the medium-wave dial. They issued warnings to troops about untrustworthy broadcasts. The fact that those warnings needed to be issued is itself a measure of Aspidistra's reach. By comparison, the Americans operated a similar propaganda station, Radio 1212, with respectable results. But Radio 1212 lacked Aspidistra's raw power, and it lacked the extraordinary nimbleness of its frequency management. The Soviet-backed German People's Radio, impressed by what Soldatensender Calais had achieved, was partly inspired by its methods. Germany, for its part, had the Goliath transmitter, which was technically more powerful, but Goliath was used exclusively for radio telegraphy communications with U-boats, not for broadcasting. As a propaganda weapon operating in the medium-wave band, Aspidistra had no peer. The night fighter disruption operations are perhaps easier to assess in material terms. Every RAF bomber that reached its target because a Luftwaffe night fighter was sent to the wrong grid reference represented a direct, quantifiable military benefit. Every aircrew that came home because the voice in their enemy's headphones was not German represented a life saved. The full records of those operations remain in some cases classified, and precise figures are genuinely unknown. What is not in doubt is that the operations were conducted, that they were considered valuable enough to continue, and that they required exactly the kind of overwhelming signal power that Aspidistra uniquely provided. There is also the question of legacy. Aspidistra pioneered, in analog and in wartime, techniques that would become the foundations of information warfare in the digital age. The intrusion operations of March and April 1945 anticipated by decades the concept of hijacking an information stream, inserting false content, and delivering it to an audience that believes it is receiving authoritative communication. The modern term for this is a man-in-the-middle attack. In 1945, it was just called Aspidistra's operators doing their jobs. After the war, Aspidistra did not go dark. The BBC, which had fought bitterly against its existence in 1942, The corporation had loudly protested that a secret government transmitter was an affront to its monopoly on British broadcasting. Now gladly took it over for the external service, beaming programs into Eastern Europe throughout the Cold War. The Crowborough station officially remained property of the Foreign Office, staffed not by BBC engineers but by the Diplomatic Wireless Service, right until its last day of operation. In 1965, during the crisis following Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence, the transmitter was reportedly deployed to reach into rebel-controlled territory. In 1967, when pirate radio ships broadcasting pop music from the North Sea were finally silenced by the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act, Aspidistra was among the transmitters used to jam their signals. The machine that had once confused the German High Command was now deployed against Radio London. In 1978, a major reorganization of European radio frequencies reduced Aspidistra to a single allocated wavelength, 648 kHz. It continued to broadcast until the 28th of September, 1982. On that day, Harold Robin, the very man who had negotiated the purchase of the transmitter from RCA 40 years earlier, who had seen it safely across the Atlantic, who had overseen its installation in the Sussex forest, carried out its final shutdown. The station was decommissioned in 1984. The underground bunker was subsequently converted into a data storage facility. There is no public museum dedicated to Aspidistra. There is no heritage plaque in the Ashdown forest marking the spot where the three 110-meter masts once stood. The records were classified, the operators sworn to silence, and the whole enterprise simply folded back into the secret history of a war that Britain preferred, in its official versions, to remember as one of straightforward courage and endurance rather than brilliant, systematic, industrial-scale deceit. Return to that night in March 1945. A German family sits by the wireless. The sirens have stopped. The all-clear has sounded. The radio is on, as it always is, the familiar sound of the Reich network filling the room. An announcer speaks. The voice is perfectly correct, the tone exactly as it should be. There's nothing to suggest that anything unusual is happening. Somewhere in Sussex, in a concrete room 50 feet underground, an operator lifts a headphone away from one ear and glances at the clock. The intrusion is running cleanly. The German network has no idea it has been replaced. The listeners have no idea they are hearing a foreign voice. The frequency is holding. The power is holding. 600 kilowatts aimed eastward into the heart of the Reich. Consider what that represented. Britain in 1942 was a country that had survived the Blitz, had sent its army to the beaches of Dunkirk and brought it home, and was now, for the first time, beginning to believe it might win. It did not win only with tanks and bombers and aircraft carriers, though all of those were vital. It won also with this, a machine purchased from an American broadcaster because Washington's regulators wouldn't allow it to be used at home, hidden in an English forest under 50 feet of concrete, operated by men and women whose names were classified for decades, doing something that had never been done before at anything like this scale. They did not simply jam the German signal. Jamming was crude, detectable, answerable. They became the German signal. They walked into the frequency as though they owned it, because at 600 kilowatts they did, and they used it with a calm, systematic, devastating patience. The German military spent considerable effort trying to find the source of the interference. They could not. The source was in England, but it sounded like it was standing in the street outside. That is what Aspidistra was. Not merely a transmitter, not merely a propaganda tool, it was a machine for the industrialized manufacturing of doubt, delivered at the speed of light, across a continent in the enemy's own voice. Its operators understood something that military planners of every era rediscover at great cost, that the most powerful weapon in any war is not the one that destroys what your enemy has. It is the one that makes your enemy uncertain whether they can trust anything at all, the biggest Aspidistra in the world. And nobody talked about it for 50 years.